Did you know that one of the most ruthless serial killers in early American history was a woman who hid her crimes in plain sight, right along a quiet state border? What if I told you that beneath an ordinary farmhouse, men, women, and even children were chained in darkness, waiting to be sold or killed? This is not folklore. This is real history, and it began with a plow horse sinking into the ground. In the spring of 1829, a tenant farmer working land near the border of Delaware and Maryland felt his horse suddenly lurch forward as the soil collapsed beneath its hooves. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a shallow sinkhole, but when the farmer dug into the earth to free his animal, his shovel struck wood. Buried just below the surface was a crude wooden chest. When it was forced open, what lay inside shocked everyone who saw it. Human bones, yellowed with age, arranged unnaturally, the skull cracked by what appeared to be a violent blow. This was no accident. This was murder. That single discovery opened the door to a nightmare that had been festering unnoticed for nearly 20 years. Over the following weeks, authorities uncovered multiple burial sites on the same property. At least 7 bodies were found, including the remains of children, and all of them led back to one name whispered in fear across the Delmarva Peninsula: Martha or Patty Cannon. By the time the bones were unearthed, Cannon's reputation was already infamous among free African Americans and escaped slaves. For years, people had vanished along rural roads after accepting job offers or while traveling alone. They were never seen again. Now the truth was finally surfacing. Cannon was not just a kidnapper. She was the architect of what historians would later call the Reverse Underground Railroad, a brutal operation that abducted free black citizens and escapees, dragging them south to be sold back into slavery. But trafficking was only part of her story. Anyone who threatened her operation, rival traders, witnesses, even children, was eliminated. Court documents from Sussex County would later reveal that Cannon was formally charged with 4 murders. Yet testimony from those who survived suggested the real number was far higher, possibly exceeding 20 lives taken directly by her hand. And that count didn't include the hundreds of people she sold into bondage, never to return home. The reason her crimes went undetected for so long lay partly in geography. Her property sat at a crossroads of 3 jurisdictions, Delaware and 2 counties in Maryland. In an era with no coordinated law enforcement, stepping across a state line could mean instant safety. Roads were little more than dirt paths. Towns were days away, and the surrounding forests and marshlands swallowed secrets with ease. Locals referred to the area simply as Johnson's Crossroads, named for a tavern that stood at the center of it all. Above ground, the region looked unremarkable: pine woods, scattered farmhouses, slow-moving rivers. Below the surface, it hid cages, graves, and silence. The waterways allowed wagons and boats to move captives under cover of night. The isolation ensured no one heard screams or cared to investigate if they did. Patty Cannon arrived in this borderland around the 1790s, presenting herself as nothing more than a farmer's wife. She married Jesse Cannon and lived a life that to outsiders appeared ordinary. But behind closed doors, something else was taking shape. Her home would soon contain hidden rooms and underground spaces designed not for storage, but for people. What began as quiet rumors would eventually erupt into one of the most horrifying criminal revelations in American history. And the buried chest found by that farmer was only the beginning. Long before the first grave was uncovered, the world that allowed Patty Cannon to thrive was already soaked in injustice. The early 1800s were a turning point in American slavery. In 1808, Congress outlawed the importation of enslaved people from Africa, but this did not weaken slavery, it transformed it. As cotton plantations exploded across Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia, the demand for enslaved labor skyrocketed. A person who might have sold for a few $100s before the ban could now fetch over 1,000 in the Deep South. Human beings became commodities of unprecedented value, and wherever profit grows, predators follow. The Delmarva Peninsula was especially vulnerable. Maryland and Delaware had large populations of free African Americans, men and women who worked as laborers, craftsmen, and farmers. On paper, they were free. In reality, their freedom was fragile. They could not vote, serve on juries, or testify against white citizens in court. Many were required to carry documents proving their status at all times. Lose those papers or have them stolen, and freedom could vanish overnight. Disappearances were common, investigations rare. To white society, these losses barely registered. Patty Cannon understood this better than anyone. She was described by contemporaries as physically imposing, nearly 6 feet tall, unusually strong, with a deep, commanding voice and a violent temper. People feared her, but fear alone does not stop evil when the law refuses to look closely. After her husband Jesse died under suspicious circumstances around 1826, some later whispered that he had been poisoned, Patty gained full control of the property that straddled the state line. By then, she was already deeply entangled in crime. Her rise was not accidental. It was deliberate, strategic, and built through family ties. Her daughter's first husband, Henry Brighton, was a blacksmith by trade and a kidnapper by habit. His work allowed him to travel freely, moving from farm to farm, town to town. While shoeing horses and repairing tools, he studied families, noted who was vulnerable, and identified young people who could be lured with promises of work. In 1811, Brighton was arrested for kidnapping and jailed in Georgetown, Delaware, but even that failed. He escaped custody, reinforcing a dangerous lesson. The system was weak, and escape was possible. Soon after, the gang escalated from kidnapping to murder. In a chilling case preserved in court records, Brighton, Patty Cannon, and another accomplice ambushed a slave trader passing through the region. They got him drunk at Cannon's establishment, robbed him of his money and captives, and then killed him to erase the witness. His body was buried on the property. That crime marked a turning point. Murder was no longer a risk, it was a tool. Brighton was eventually captured and executed in 1813, but Patty Cannon walked free. Rather than retreat, she adapted. The execution taught her not that crime was dangerous, but that it required better planning, tighter control, and more silence. Her daughter remarried, this time to Joseph Johnson, a man far more dangerous than Brighton. Johnson was not just a criminal, he was an organizer. He owned a tavern positioned directly on the Delaware-Maryland border, with different rooms falling under different state jurisdictions. Lawmen chasing suspects could be stopped by a single step across a threshold. The tavern became the nerve center of an expanding operation, a legitimate business above ground, a prison below it. Hidden rooms, underground cells, iron rings set into stone walls, these were not improvised spaces. They were built with purpose. Men, women, and children were chained in darkness, held for weeks or months until transport south was arranged. Their identities were stripped away, papers destroyed, names changed. Resistance was beaten out of them. The gang that formed around Cannon and Johnson was disturbingly diverse. White criminals handled sales. Mixed-race decoys gained trust in black communities. Even enslaved people were forced to help capture others. Fear, profit, and racism bound them together. And for years, no one stopped them. By the early 1820s, Patty Cannon's operation had grown far beyond a local kidnapping ring. It had become a coordinated interstate machine. Victims were taken from Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland, then quietly moved south through back roads and waterways, vanishing into the slave markets of Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. Families searched, communities whispered, but official attention remained scarce. To most authorities, free African Americans were people who could disappear without consequence. What made the operation so effective was deception. Cannon's gang rarely relied on brute force alone. Instead, they preyed on hope. Young men were offered steady work on distant farms. Women were promised domestic positions with good wages. Parents, struggling to survive in a hostile economy, sometimes allowed their children to go, believing opportunity waited just beyond the horizon. By the time the truth became clear, it was already too late. One of the few who survived to tell her story was Lydia Smith, a 25-year-old free woman kidnapped in 1825. Her testimony later became one of the most damning pieces of evidence against Cannon. Lydia described being seized on a road near Philadelphia, blindfolded, chained, and hauled south by wagon over several days. When she arrived at Cannon's property, she was taken underground into a hidden chamber beneath the house. There, she discovered she was not alone.
Dozens of captives passed through those rooms. Men, women, and children were kept in separate areas, all restrained, fed barely enough to survive. Darkness was constant. Silence was enforced. Lydia testified that people were routinely beaten for resisting, crying, or asking questions. The worst fear was not pain, but waiting, knowing that transport south meant permanent enslavement, separation from family, and the erasure of identity. Inside this system was a boy named Cyrus James. Cannon had purchased Cyrus as a child and raised him in her household. As he grew older, she forced him into the operation, using him as a decoy to approach potential victims. Because he was young and mixed race, people trusted him. He knew the roads, the signals, the hiding places. He also knew the graves. Cannon controlled Cyrus through a brutal mix of favoritism and terror. One moment, she treated him as indispensable. The next, she reminded him that she could sell or kill him without consequence. Over time, he witnessed things that would haunt him forever. Later, he would testify that he saw Cannon murder children, some sick, some injured, some simply inconvenient. In one account, he described her carrying a wounded child away in her apron. The child never returned. These were not crimes of passion, they were decisions. Children who became liabilities were eliminated. Captives who insisted on their free status were silenced. Witnesses disappeared. Murder was simply another method of risk management. Ironically, what finally drew attention to Cannon's crimes was not the suffering of her black victims, but the disappearance of white slave traders. These men carried large sums of cash and had business partners who demanded answers when they failed to return. When traders vanished after visiting Cannon's property, questions followed. Horses were found, stories didn't add up, money went missing. By the mid-1820s, pressure was building. A determined Philadelphia official began tracking disappearances and offering rewards for information. Former associates, frightened and greedy, began talking. Cannon responded the only way she knew how, by killing more witnesses. But violence leaves traces, and in 1829, the earth itself finally spoke. When that farmer's plow broke through a hidden grave, the silence that had protected Patty Cannon for decades shattered. Excavations revealed bodies buried in wooden boxes, some belonging to children. The pattern was unmistakable. This was not isolated crime. It was systematic slaughter. And the one person who could explain it all was Cyrus James. When Cyrus James was captured in the spring of 1829, he knew there was no escaping what was coming. He had lived his entire life under Patty Cannon's control, forced into crimes he never chose, carrying secrets that could either condemn him or finally set him free. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the discovery of bodies exactly where he knew they would be, Cyrus made a decision that would change American criminal history. He told everything. His testimony stunned investigators.
Cyrus described in chilling detail how Cannon, Joseph Johnson, and Johnson's brother had murdered a slave trader while the man sat eating supper. He watched them move the body into a specially built wooden box and bury it on the property. But that was only one story. Cyrus led authorities to grave after grave, each one confirming his words. Wooden chests, shallow pits, bones of adults and children alike.
In one garden area, investigators uncovered the remains of a mixed-race child. Cyrus explained that Cannon killed the child because she feared the father might be white, possibly someone who could bring scrutiny. Another grave held the remains of a child Cyrus said Cannon had beaten to death with a piece of wood. These discoveries horrified even hardened lawmen. This was not just a trafficker, this was a serial killer. As word spread, witnesses who had lived in fear for years began to come forward. One man described escaping a job offer that suddenly felt wrong. Others admitted they had seen wagons arriving at night, heard cries, or noticed people who entered Cannon's property, never leaving. For years they had said nothing. Now, with proof in the ground, silence felt impossible. Authorities from Delaware, Maryland, and Pennsylvania coordinated in an unprecedented investigation. Search warrants allowed full excavation of Cannon's properties. Every finding reinforced the same conclusion. These murders were planned, repeated, and deliberate. Some remains suggested victims had been buried alive. On April 13, 1829, a Delaware grand jury issued indictments against Martha Patty Cannon on 4 counts of murder. Each charge carried the death penalty. The victims included children and adults, killed over a span of years. For the first time, a white woman was being formally charged for murdering African Americans in a system that had rarely valued black lives at all. Cannon showed no remorse. At nearly 70 years old, she reportedly spoke of her crimes as business decisions. Witnesses described her as defiant, confused only by the fact that authorities considered her actions criminal. In her mind, she had merely protected her interests. During her confinement in the Georgetown jail, she allegedly confessed to killing more than 24 people. The casual tone of these admissions terrified those who heard them. The trial was set. Newspapers across the region prepared for what would be one of the most significant criminal cases of the era. Public execution seemed inevitable. But Patty Cannon would never face a jury. On May 11, 1829, jail guards found her dead in her cell. The official cause was suicide by poison, believed to be arsenic. How she obtained it was never conclusively determined. Some believed sympathizers smuggled it in. Others suspected she had planned her escape from justice from the moment she was arrested. Her death denied victims and their families the closure of a verdict, yet it also ended one of the most horrifying criminal enterprises of early America. Cyrus James, the boy forced into darkness, was freed for his cooperation. He was relocated north and given protection, disappearing into a new life far from the graves he helped uncover. But the damage was irreversible. Hundreds had been sold, families destroyed, lives erased. Patty Cannon's death did not end the questions, it only deepened them. With the central figure gone, investigators were left piecing together fragments of a criminal network that stretched far beyond one farmhouse on a state line. The trial that never happened meant many truths would die with her, but what remained was still enough to horrify an entire nation. In the weeks following her suicide, authorities continued searching properties connected to the Cannon-Johnson operation. What they found confirmed their worst fears. The gang had trafficked not dozens, but hundreds of people. Conservative estimates suggested between 500 and 1,000 free African Americans had been kidnapped and sold into slavery through this network. Many were never identified by name. They vanished into southern plantations, their past lives erased completely.
Joseph Johnson, Cannon's son-in-law and primary partner, was never brought to justice. He fled south before arrests could be made, disappearing into the same regions where his victims had been sold. His brother vanished as well. Law enforcement made weak attempts to pursue them, but the distance, lack of coordination, and limited resources of the era meant they were effectively untouchable. Justice, once again, favored the criminals. Cyrus James became one of the few bright points in an otherwise grim ending. Recognizing that he had been enslaved, coerced, and psychologically controlled, the courts granted him freedom. Abolitionists helped him relocate and begin a new life. Some accounts suggest he later assisted legitimate Underground Railroad efforts, using his painful knowledge to help others escape rather than be captured. His survival was rare and hard-won.
The land itself carried the memory of what happened. The crossroads where Cannon operated was eventually renamed in an attempt to escape its reputation, but locals never forgot. Property values stagnated. Families moved away. Even generations later, people spoke of the area with unease. When Cannon's remains were moved years later, her skull was grotesquely displayed as a curiosity, a reminder of how deeply her crimes had burned into public consciousness. Patty Cannon's story matters because it exposes truths often ignored. It shows how racism allowed crimes to flourish unchecked, how legal loopholes and jurisdictional confusion became shields for evil, and how society's indifference to certain lives made systematic violence possible. Her reverse Underground Railroad stands as a dark mirror to the stories of escape and freedom, proof that for every rescue, there were countless betrayals. This was not just one woman's cruelty. It was a system that enabled her. And it is a reminder that history's darkest chapters are not always hidden, they are often ignored. If this story disturbed you, it should. Share it with someone who believes history should be remembered, not buried. Like this video to support telling the stories others tried to erase. And subscribe with notifications on so you never miss another journey into the forgotten crimes of the past.